Hi there, and welcome to this, which is our last Smart Building Series webinar for 2018. I'm really pleased to have with us today a guy called Chris Pottage from Skanska UK, and I will introduce him in a little bit. We're going to be talking about driving sustainable buildings through occupant health and well-being. So it's going to be some really interesting information. So yeah, stay tuned. Just some housekeeping from me. I want to say thank you to our sponsor. This is Haystack Connect. Next year, Haystack, that's Project Haystack, are holding their biannual conference, and it's going to be on May the 13th to the 15th in California. If you're interested in, open source semantic tagging for IoT data in the building specific, then please check that out. It's going to be a great opportunity to meet people, talk about tagging of data and all that good stuff as it relates to smart buildings. And also, we are recording this. So if you would like to share with colleagues, then either this evening or tomorrow, I'll be putting up the link on SoundCloud, and it'll be up on our website. So I'll send out the link to that. But also, you can subscribe to us on iTunes as well. If you search for Smart Building Series through Apple Podcasts, you will find us, and you'll get all of our monthly podcasts that way. So without further ado, let me say hi to Chris. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi there. How are you?
Very well. And as I said, thanks for joining us today. I think this is a super interesting topic about driving health through sustainable buildings. And I'm going to hand it over to you now. Maybe you can start by just telling us, a little bit about what you work with.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the intro, and thank you very much for the invite. Obviously, it's a real pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing and share it with in these forums. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Just
Yeah,
sorry, Chris. One thing I forgot to mention. If anyone has any questions, then please just type them in, and I'll make sure Chris gets them after his presentation. Thanks. Sorry about that.
That's all right, no worries. So my name is Chris Pottage. I work for Skanska UK's Environment Department. And my role is as a Sustainable and Healthy Buildings Officer. As such, it is my role to look for the links between sustainable or green building design and operation and health and well-being outcomes and benefits for occupants. So today I'm going to talk you through a little bit of the background research which has led to the growth of a healthy buildings movement. Then I'm going to talk you through a little bit of my work and talk a little bit about the challenges that that I am presented with on a daily or weekly basis, and to talk a little bit about the role of the Internet of Things and of technology in enhancing the approach that I'm developing. You might notice that in places I've probably taken what you might term as a slightly analog approach to all of this, based on limitations of projects and budgets and so on. So you might look at this as me identifying a need and an opportunity for Internet of Things enabled solutions to really enhance the built environment in terms of the way we manage buildings for sustainability, and then in terms of making recommendations for how we develop our estates strategies and estates investment in the future. So I'm just going to click onto the next slide. Oh, there we go. So I've worked at Skanska since around 2011. It was actually summer of 2011 I started. And I started really looking into the links between sustainability and energy efficiency, which was my background remit, and the links with health and well-being of buildings occupants in around 2013 when I wrote my MSc dissertation on the topic. I was very fortunate in that by doing that dissertation and conducting occupant perception surveys at some of our Skanska offices, I was then asked to go on secondment in 2014 to the World Green Building Council to produce a report called Health, Wellbeing, Productivity in Offices, the next chapter for green buildings. This report received a very positive response from industry. It puts forward evidence for the benefits of health and well-being in green buildings, but it also puts forward a framework of metrics for making that business case yourself in your own corporation. And as a result of that report, the Better Places for People campaign was born, and is still going. So if you look online at betterplacesforpeople.org, you'll find a lot of resources and information around health and well-being in green buildings across various sectors. So as I've mentioned today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background and drivers for healthy buildings. That will in turn touch on the business case and metrics and how we can use health and well-being of occupants to try and enhance returns on green or sustainable buildings. I'll then very briefly introduce you to the Well Building Standard. I suspect many of you will already know what that is, so I won't go into a great deal of detail, but I feel that any presentation around healthy buildings and what constitutes a healthy building would be remiss if it did not acknowledge what is probably the most prominent standard globally. I'll then touch upon some of our pilot projects that we've been working on with our healthcare clients in our facilities management business, and that will lead us into the role of IoT. It's certainly, I'll be offering you my take on some pitfalls and challenges that that we are presented with in considering the role of IoT. Whereas I would probably be looking more to the audience for the expertise around how to develop and implement those solutions. And finally, I'll look more broadly at the challenges facing the healthy buildings movement. So the reason we are all here, the reason I have the role that I have, and the reason for the growth of interest in around health and well-being in buildings is that we are increasingly coming to understand that buildings have a profound impact on their occupants. This perhaps started as a counterpoint sort of movement in around the 70s and 80s, 1970s, 1980s, with the realization of sick building syndrome, which is the negative impacts that a workplace could and indeed was having on a number of workplace occupants. These impacts, they manifest themselves in the physical environment, have an impact on individuals and humans within a workplace, which in turn can have a knock-on impact on bottom line organizational finances. There's an awful lot of evidence for these impacts and for these potential benefits out there, but I suppose it's this process of developing research and work around healthy buildings has been a process of taking a lot of what is disparate information and putting it into a set of tangible and coherent resources which might have more of an impact on investment decisions. So a bit more around the background, and I'm going to go slightly in reverse order here. I'm going to start in 2016 and then I'm going to go back to 2014. But in 2016, the Stoddart review, which is a facilities management industry report which was launched in the UK, made a series of recommendations around workplace effectiveness and around how the workplace can impact occupants and the national productivity rate and national economy as a result. In that report, they cited that 53% of office occupants state that their office enables them to work productively. That was a statistic cited from the Leesman Index, which is a global workplace effectiveness survey with an extremely large, or well, a large and quickly growing database. I think around the time of this statistic, there were around 200,000 individual responses in around 1,500 office buildings globally. So 53%, it's not bad on one side, but of course the flip side of that is that 47% of people who work in offices don't think that it enables them to work productively, which is, I mean, to me that seems a little bit ridiculous without wishing to put too fine a point on it. But if we build office buildings to be productive as an organization and as a company, then they must serve the purpose that we build them for. So an unhealthy or unproductive building, in my view, is an unsustainable building. The UK, the Stoddart review actually points out that in the UK there is an 18% productivity deficit with our G7 counterparts, i.e. the national productivity rate in the UK is 18% below the average of the G7. So if we were able to increase UK productivity by around 1%, we could be looking at, you know, around 20 billion annually as an enhancement to our economy. Other key messages from the report are as follows. Firstly, there is the value ratio that comes with buildings and people and organizations. People account for around 90% of operational costs within commercial organizations. Property would account for around 7 to 9%, and then energy would account for around 1%. So firstly, what I take from that is that at around 7 to 9%, property, whilst not being the biggest cost, it is a significant cost base in an organization. So we should be managing our workplaces. We should be appraising them and managing them to improve their performance on an annual basis. Not enough organizations do this. And indeed, one of the issues cited in the Stoddart review is that one of the key metrics of workplace effectiveness or workplace efficiency, certainly in the UK, is the number of people per meter squared, or number of meters squared per people in an office. So ultimately, it's around how many people you can get into a space, with a presumption that productivity would grow exponentially based on the numbers that the absolute numbers within there. I think this fails to recognise that some of the key drivers of productivity being more emotional and coming down to individuals' well-being and perceptions of a workplace and indeed how that will have an impact on their focus, their concentration, their productivity. So going through the Stoddart review, some of its key recommendations, it points out that while we understand that the office is not the only factor that will impact productivity, it is one of the key tools that we have at our disposal in terms of being able to manage that productivity, in terms of being able to improve that productivity and impact bottom line business finances and the national economy. So the last real key message from the Stoddart review then is that we need to be able to measure effectively the performance of our office buildings in order to be able to manage and improve them. And that then takes me back to the World Green Building Council report that I was a part of in 2014. Over on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the value equation articulated in a slightly different way here. But once again, we've got a rough ratio of 1% on energy, 9% in this case on rental costs, and 90% on staff costs. The finer numbers there might vary slightly, but what's really key is the scale of that ratio. So any energy saving refurbishment project that might be carried out to an existing building, for an example, which looks to save around 40% of energy, which is quite ambitious, would essentially be affecting 0.4% of operational costs. Now, if you were, in addition to that energy saving, able to demonstrate just a 0.5 to 1% improvement in the staff costs, then you've either doubled or tripled your returns instantly. So the issue then becomes: are we able to reliably measure and demonstrate this in order to really demonstrate those financial returns, which make investment more palatable to those who make those decisions? So in the 2014 report, we separated it into two key parts. The first part was gathering evidence, putting it into one easy to use resource and making it available to a broader, perhaps less technical audience. The second part of the report was where we tried to encourage organisations to go out, take this information and make their own business cases in their own building. We were quite aware of the disparate nature of a lot of the research. There is really a lot of research around, and some of it really compelling, but there's a great range of situations, there's a great range of metrics, of methodologies, of assessment processes, and so on. And indeed, there's a great range of outcomes in terms of the benefits or not of a healthier building. So we wanted to put something together which allows organisations to go out and gather this evidence themselves through using metrics that, you know, in many cases they will already be applying in another sense. So we put forward a framework of metrics with three key pillars. Firstly, physical metrics are metrics of the indoor environment, or the physical environment, if you will. So things such as air quality, noise levels, thermal comfort or temperature ranges, and so on, which can all be measured and given a finite output. Perceptual metrics is where we really get to ask a direct question to occupants and ask how they rate physical elements of their office environment, and indeed how much they think it might affect them. And finally, the financial metrics is where we would look to bring this back to bottom line finances. Ideally, that would be through a measure of productivity, but of course, certainly in the UK, where you know, the large majority of our workforce is in a knowledge-based industry, actually measuring productivity can be very difficult. So the financial metrics might simply be proxies of productivity, or indeed financial costs that you can associate to human behaviour, human well-being, and human outcomes within an organisation. I think one final point on this then was, you know, we really wanted to make this as simple as possible so that it would actually be used by corporations. And that was one of the key issues that we found in carrying out the research, is that, you know, a lot of academic evidence or pockets of industry evidence doesn't always have the influence that you would like it to on decision makers. So what better way to influence those decisions than for organizations to make their own business cases? So in a little bit of, I suppose, relatively fortuitous timing, around the time that we launched that report, which was September 2014, Skanska, I was going back to my old role in Skanska, or slightly updated role in Skanska, and we were actually just about to move into a new office building. This is called Bentley Works, or the office itself is called Neelands House, and this is Skanska UK's northern hub, and has become one of our green flagship projects. It's a BREEAM outstanding prefabricated concrete panel office construction, which is also Skanska Deep Green, which is Skanska's branded sustainable indicator on our projects. This fortuitous timing essentially allowed me to conduct pre-move surveys before that office population moved into the new office, and then conduct post-move surveys around 6 months after they'd moved in, and then again around 18 months after they'd moved in. And what I did was I integrated this with a post-occupancy evaluation process. So I also conducted a thorough energy analysis, including weather correction and so on, and calculated estimated carbon savings and calculated actual utility cost savings for the year 2015 against the baseline year 2013. We also saw from the perception surveys there were some great perceptions and great engagement from occupants. But one of the really interesting things from my point of view was that through carrying out a bit of analysis and some pretty conservative estimations, I estimated that there was around about a £28,000 absence saving in 2015 for that office population, which consisted of just over 100 people, around between 110 and 115 people, fluctuating slightly. And this absence saving, as you can see, the green payback based on utility cost savings and the green spend on the project, which was about £800,000, was around 11 years. And by factoring in that absence saving, we brought that that payback period down by 3 years to just over 8 years. And that's just through looking at one of the financial metrics, of which there are many. So, unfortunately, at the time, we didn't have historical absence data for the Bentley or Neelands House office. So I had to calculate those savings through looking at an average across a number of Skanska offices. And again, in a little bit of fortuitous timing, another Skanska colleague of mine was commissioning Leaseman to run their survey on 5 of our UK offices, 5 of our main UK offices. And on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see the Leaseman scores for each of those offices. Leaseman, as I alluded to earlier, is a workplace effectiveness survey. It's an occupant perception survey where occupants rate the importance of the activities that they have to do, and they rate the equipment and facilities that the office provides in allowing them to do that productively. Individual responses are rolled up on a building by building basis, and they receive a score out of 100. A score of 70 receives the Leaseman Plus tag, which essentially denotes a very high quality building. What you can see with the Skanska offices is obviously quite a large range, and actually we've got one office at either extreme of the scale. Neelands House, the Bentley project, which I showed you on the previous slide, scored 78.9, which at that time was one of the highest scores on the entire database. However, the medium-small office at the top, ironically, the office that I was based in at that time scored a fairly lowly 39, which I am aware is pretty close to the bottom of the scale. I am pleased to say, however, that we no longer occupy that office. Anyway, looking at this, I had also been looking at the absence for Neelands House, and I had calculated an average across those 5 offices. I then looked at the deviation from that average to calculate a days lost per employee per quarter figure for all of those office for all of the occupants of those offices. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, there's some pretty significant inverse correlation. In fact, the worst office has absence around 9 times higher than the best office, and indeed the best office has much lower absence than all of the other offices. So this for me was real food for thought, and really gives us something to get our teeth into in terms of investigating this relationship. Of course, I wouldn't be so bold as to say that correlations such as this would demonstrate any kind of causal link. But what we have seen as we've gone through our investigations is more and more correlations like this. Okay, so moving away from my work for a moment, I'd just like to give a nod, I suppose, to the Well-Building Standard, which is probably what I would see as the most prominent benchmark of what constitutes a healthy building at the moment. The Well-Building Standard is similar to a lot of environmental rating systems such as LEED or BREEAM, in that it places design and build requirements on a building, in their case to ensure better or lower environmental impact. However, the reason WELL stands out is because it really puts humans at the center of the design process. So this is a building standard which rates how good it is for the people who occupy it. A secondary function is certainly to cross over and to work in harmony with environmental standards, but its primary goal is to prioritize the person and the health and well-being of the occupant, and to promote healthier lifestyles for those occupants. Another key feature of WELL is that there is a real focus on operation, and actually you have to recertify a WELL certified building every 3 years. Therefore, it is not possible to go through a design process, tick a number of boxes, receive a certification at handover stage, and then forget about it. Your building has to be managed and maintained to retain the levels of quality that have been specified by the standard. Now, WELL has grown fairly quickly in the last 4 or 5 years. Indeed, it actually grew its first 2 years out after its launch. It actually grew quicker than LEED did over the corresponding period after its launch. And I would say that it really captures the imagination. Certainly in terms of benefits for the tenant, we know that health, well-being and productivity improvements within your organization promote better brand publicity. It promotes a value-driven approach to doing business, and in turn it can improve your business performance. And for the developer, we believe that this should lead to better rental yields, higher occupancy rates and higher asset values. However, this value chain is slightly fragmented in our property markets, and what we find is often, certainly with a core and shell or a Cat A project, the cost and risk associated with pursuing a standard such as WELL is very much front-end loaded, and it falls on the owner and the developer, whereas the benefits, the outcomes, the productivity and the value enhancement and brand enhancement is predominantly enjoyed by the tenant. So one of the issues that we probably need to think about in terms of healthy buildings and moving forward is how to address that fragmented value chain. However, despite of that, on the right-hand side, you can see from the graphic, says there are actually 962 WELL projects registered. I have to confess that this graphic is slightly out of date, and actually the 1000th project was registered in early October, and indeed we're pushing up to that 200 million square foot mark now. One of the key issues with WELL and key deterrents, as I've mentioned, it's this slightly fragmented value chain and the potential risk involved with pursuing a WELL project. What this does is it makes WELL, I suppose, firstly, it can be quite expensive. Firstly, in terms of registration fees, but secondly, in terms of the design or the quality uplift that you might need to implement to your design or to your build in order to achieve the standard. The result of that is that even with 1,000 or so registered projects, the well building standard or well certified buildings are not likely to account for the majority of workplaces for quite a long time, if at all. So one of the issues that troubles me with healthy buildings is, how do we make this available to everyone, regardless of whether you are part of that fortunate few who occupy a kind of prime, high-end, well-certified office space. And to me, the answer lies in the way that we operate and manage buildings. So moving on then, I was just doing a time check there, so I got about 10 or 11 minutes left of talking. So moving on then, after our discoveries around the correlation between building quality or the Leesman scores and absence, we started to look at how we can deliver this in other environments, and how we can work with our clients to develop this understanding and this ability to manage a space in terms of both energy, but also in terms of its indoor environment quality and its human outcomes. So we devised, or I devised, an energy and healthy buildings audit program, which I was able to piggyback on a waste audit program in some of our healthcare customers' estates. As such, we had people going around every room in our customers' hospitals, checking on waste compliance, so checking what's being put in which bins and where. And that gave us an opportunity to ask the auditors to start to develop perception audits. So I created a survey for them, which was put onto an iPad, so they could essentially just input the data, and they were asked to rate indoor environment quality, or give a healthy building rating based on how they rate air quality, noise levels, thermal comfort, lighting, daylighting, and so on, and to rate energy efficient behavior. So, are the lights on but nobody's in the room, or there's electronic equipment on and no one in the room, or there's cooling on in summer and a window open, for example. And each of these responses had a weighted had a weighted impact on the scale, which rolled up into the audit ratings. So by doing this, we were able to provide a rating for every single room. We could roll it up to the whole hospital level, break it down by department, by ward, by block, by individual room, by month, and by year, and so on. We were then able to use this to give us indications of where there were environmental problems within the hospital, and then use indoor environment quality monitors to confirm or falsify those perceptions. We then worked with the trust to try to access some of their financial and human metrics, and used all of this information in integration to draw conclusions and recommendations on A, how to manage the building, and B, on future investment in the estate. So what you can see here is a basic roll-up of the energy score and the healthy building score, and that is averaged to a combined score. That is on the chart on the left-hand side. And then on the lower right, you can see ratings by block, where the same information is broken down by block location. And then you can see at the top there are a number of tabs. This is on an Excel Power BI output. There's a number of tabs. You can click on them and drill down to the individual scores for each room or ward or whatever you may want to do. So in doing this, we found a number of patterns, and one of them is what we saw in ward 5 and 6, or wards 5 and 6, which is looking at the trust's absence rate and absolute absence cost for the last 12 months. We found there were certain wards that had particularly high absence and particularly low energy and healthy buildings rating. And what you can see there for wards 5 and 6, you have the air quality, biophilia, daylight, and so on, ratings for that whole ward as an average. And you can see there are a few prevailing issues, i.e. air quality is poor. There's not a lot of biophilia being plants or nature. There's a real issue with thermal comfort, and indeed the lighting, the internal lighting system is not deemed to be particularly good. If we then roll that down to all of the rooms within that ward, we see another interesting pattern. What you see there is a lot of the same prevailing indoor environment issues, i.e. poor air quality, poor thermal comfort, and so on. But we see that there are a number of rooms within the ward that sit above the zero axis and a number that sit below. And actually, when we look a little bit more closely, we can see that that actually those that sit above the axis are largely patient areas, and those that sit below are largely staff areas. Now, of course, it's an entirely justified approach for an NHS trust to put most of their effort into improving the patient areas within a hospital. But this made me ask myself the question, well, if these are the people that are providing the care, if we are investing in them and in their comfort, would they not therefore provide better care as a result, i.e. their well-being and their productivity would improve, which could have a tangible outcome for the NHS trust? And of course, in the NHS, as soon as we start to talk about absence costs, and further still start to talk about patient stays within a hospital and how we can affect that, we start to see some serious potential financial benefits. So this was a pattern that we found not just in wards 5 and 6, but across a number of the wards. And actually, what I managed to deduce from the absence data was that the top 5 wards for absence cost accounted for about $500,000 of the 1.15 million annual absence cost. And these wards all also had poor energy and healthy buildings ratings. So we're seeing that the environmental audits are telling us that these are the worst places in the hospital. They're actually staff areas. And what we are also seeing is that the absence rates in those areas is higher than in the rest of the hospital. That 1.15 million cost was across, I think it was 23 or 24 wards. So we can see that for the top 5 to account for nearly half of that, that's pretty significant. So as part of this program, there are a number of what I would describe as common sense findings that essentially, by looking at energy information and looking at comfort-based information, we start to see issues which are affecting the indoor environment, they're affecting the user experience, and they're affecting energy usage. So if we're going to invest in improving this estate, that is where we would achieve the most value. And we found some fairly simple recommendations which could make a significant difference. For example, we found very low humidity in certain wards, and on further investigation, we discovered that this is likely to be a result of individual standalone air conditioning units being added in an ad hoc manner to the space without integrating it with the existing services, so the existing heating and cooling system. That really dries out the air. It also really wastes energy because we're heating air that we've cooled and we're cooling air that we've heated. But what it also does is it dries out the air. It causes itchy eyes, itchy skin, rashes, dry, tickly throats. It really causes a comfort issue. We found many examples of poor thermal comfort that was entirely avoidable. We found a lot of issues with the ambient lighting, and actually, as part of the audits, we also discovered that over 60% of the hospital rooms had no external windows at all. And of course, that made me start to think about the logic of it. And of course, when you think about the way hospitals are often set out, and they're quite deep buildings, that is probably not that surprising. But what that tells me is your electronic lighting system becomes vital in a building without any windows, because the spectrum of light that provides must be sufficient to support the human circadian rhythm, which is very closely linked to sleep patterns. We also found a number of easy wins and set forward enhanced business case for our energy conservation measures. They were essentially based on the criteria that they would pay back in energy terms within 5 years, but that we could also look to demonstrate enhanced returns through the human benefits. So, moving on then, we've now repeated the first part of this program in another healthcare estate. We've updated our data model to the powered BI dashboard. We've got nearly 44,000 data points over nearly 3,000 lines and 15 categories, which is providing us very detailed locational data on the indoor environment and the issues that come within that. Indicators of energy efficient behavior. Are certain teams and departments embracing the need for energy efficiency more than others, and so on, and we're able to rate that on a scale. And provide visualized outputs. Without going into too much more detail about this project, we've started to look at some of the similar data streams. And on this chart, you can see up the y-axis on the left, we've got absence cost. And on the x-axis across the bottom, we've got the healthy buildings rating. And once again, we've seen some pretty interesting patterns, i.e., a lot of the wards with the highest absence costs also have the lowest healthy buildings ratings. So what can we do with this information? How can we use what we know about the built environment and the ability to monitor it that technology is now giving us to better understand this relationship and to manage it? Of course, just for the sake of objectivity, I should point out that it doesn't all fall in a perfect line. There are some outliers, so to speak. But once again, that's part of the challenge to myself and my colleagues to develop our expertise and develop solutions to move all of these areas in a southeasterly direction on that chart. So, moving on ultimately to the role of IoT, I think, looking at healthy buildings, you could probably currently separate them into two broad categories. One is well certified. There are not currently a huge amount of those that are operational, but there is a growing amount, and that will continue to grow. But there's also existing buildings, and I feel like there's a huge amount we can do as built environment professionals and as facilities managers to improve the way we operate buildings. And I believe that that the IoT has a huge part to play in that. So, just moving on to some of the pitfalls and challenges then. I think, as I've mentioned previously, I'm not a tech whiz. I'm an environmental professional who majors in health and well-being of building occupants. So I'm sure there's a lot of people online who can tell me more about this than I know. However, some of the pitfalls that I've come across as we've been looking to implement technologies in our sites is, being clear on the objectives and scales of what you would like to do. Thinking about the limitations of the technology, of the security of your own server. What we have found has been preferable when we've put monitors in place, we learnt this the hard way, is actually to use mobile 3G or 4G internet connections rather than try to put one of these devices on our server, because our IT guys see that as a serious security risk. Of course, one of the issues I had early in my work was I spent a long time going out and finding and collecting data, and then suddenly found that actually once you start to successfully collect multiple data streams, you need to think about how you're going to collect own and collect it, process it, analyze it, and report on it. And of course, in an ideal world, a lot of this will be automated by software, algorithms, and so on. But we have to start somewhere, and at the moment, it's a slightly more clunky process than that. If you are looking at the physical environment and making comments on health and well-being of occupants, you need to be very clear in your messages, the actions you take as the result of the information you find, and which opportunities you look to build upon. As such, there is an ethical issue there. And finally, from my point of view, I would say, you know, as a builder, as a guy who works for a building company and a development company, we want to buy an end-to-end product. We don't really want to buy a monitor from one guy and then go and buy a software solution from another guy and a maintenance package from another, and then sort of jumble it together ourselves. So that's really one of the challenges I would put out there. And just taking a step back, this is my final slide. I think broader challenges to healthy buildings and the healthy buildings movement, as I highlighted earlier, it's that fragmented value chain. If we're expecting one party to invest, how are we ensuring that they receive some benefit from that investment and thus incentivize that investment? How do we promote healthy workspaces for the majority of people? As I say, well buildings are fantastic, and the well standard is a really aspirational and innovative standard. However, it's not going to apply to most buildings anytime soon. So how can we look at our operational strategies to provide healthy buildings for all people and all workplaces? Within that, technology has a huge role to play, as does the processing and interpretation of that data, in order to develop effective operational solutions which are sustainable in that they save energy and reduce carbon impact, but also are sustainable in that they support the people, the occupants of a building, in carrying out the task that they are there to carry out. Okay, and that is all from me. I must apologise. I went slightly over time there, James, but over to you for some questions.
Yeah, not at all. I think everyone would have really appreciated that, and I know I did. Thanks for that presentation. Some super interesting things to discuss now. So yeah, as Chris said, if you have any questions for him, fire away. We've got a good few minutes to go over some of what he talked about. Chris, maybe we could just go back to the previous challenges slide. I mean, I totally echo some of the points you made, you know, about fragmented value chain, etc. Really profound points. I was interested, you know, for some of your earlier slides, you talked about absence savings, and I thought, you know, that struck a chord with me, because I guess that's one way of measuring productivity in a sense, right? Or at least trying to understand how, in inverted commas, you know, well your building is. Do you use on a frequent basis other metrics that you use to kind of measure value of building?
I mean, I think there are I suppose the framework of metrics provides a fairly standardized approach, but the metrics within that approach might vary according to the organization. So, for example, absence is probably one of the easier ones to pin down. There are certain causes of absence which we know can relate to an indoor environment or to a building, and so we can make that link that way. And of course, there is a direct link to finances. Another key metric, without getting into measuring employee performance and so on, might be looking at, or certainly is, and the key cost is looking at things like recruitment and training costs. So in a world where talent is so sought after, there's a number of factors which presumably contribute to the decision of a young talented professional to work for one company over the other. And I believe that the indoor environment and offices are are becoming one of those factors. Of course, I understand that salary and organizational culture and so on also play a big part. But I certainly, I wouldn't want to work for a great company in a rubbish office. So staff training recruitment costs, they can really amount to a lot across large corporations, especially the training side of things. So I would say that is another obvious one. In healthcare, obviously, I alluded to patient metrics. Obviously, you've got, I suppose, in a lot of hospitals, you have a staff cost for the staff that is employed by them, but you also have an absence cost for the agency staff that you need to employ to cover your absent staff. Further to that, obviously, patient metrics are very closely linked to finances within the NHS. So if you're able to start to demonstrate that you can get patients in and out of a certain ward slightly quicker, there's definitely a financial benefit to that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, all good stuff. I better get on with some questions here from the audience. We've had quite a few come in. First one, have you looked at the increased building value and lease potential with health and wellbeing programs? Have you seen a causality there?
Not a huge amount to date. It's funny, I touched upon exactly that in relation to sustainable buildings in my dissertation a few years ago, and what we find is, that is essentially the theory that the buildings that have achieved the higher ends of green rating systems, so your LEED Platinums or your BREEAM Outstandings and so on, should in theory have a higher asset value, higher rental yield, higher occupancy rates. And I remember concluding in my dissertation there was some evidence of that, but it was it was still a little bit early in terms of getting enough certified buildings operational and then getting the data from those buildings to draw those conclusions. And I think with health and wellbeing in buildings, it's exactly the same problem. Okay, so there's around 1,000 projects registered for WELL certification at the moment, but to be honest, off the top of my head, I'm not sure of the exact number of certified projects to date, but it's in the lower hundreds, I would say. So it's sorry, can you remind me?
It's an issue basically about connecting this, tenant yields to a healthy.
So we haven't got that many operational WELL buildings at the moment. So it's very difficult to access those data sets until they exist. And I would certainly expect to see that. That is certainly what the industry expects to see and the expert expect to see, the increased asset values and rental yields. But I haven't personally seen any evidence of that to date.
Okay. And then a question specific to the hospital example you gave. Does this relate to NHSI's model hospital? I'm not sure what that is, but maybe you've heard of it.
Funnily enough, no, it doesn't, and nor have I, to be totally honest.
Next question. BSI are doing something on IoT standards. What are the issues in the absence of such standards? So I guess it's more of a tech question, isn't it? But I mean, do you think there is an issue with being an absence of standards for some of the technology that you see?
Yeah, and funnily enough, I actually gave a presentation to the BSI a few weeks ago on exactly that. And of course, if we're going to the way we can monitor indoor environments can vary hugely in terms of accuracy and in terms of cost. You can buy monitors. Actually, on the slide, you can see there the two images at the top. I think that's a Cube sensor and a Netatmo. You can buy those for less than £200 and stick them in your office or in your house, and they will give you some indications of the indoor environment quality. But what they often tend to do is use one parameter as a proxy for another. So, for example, I believe the Cube sensor measures CO2 and uses it as a proxy for volatile organic compounds, or vice versa. So what that means is actually you're taking information and you're talking about the health of occupants here. Now, that I would say is a very useful indicator. It's a very useful tool for a domestic application or for a small scale commercial application, as long as the protagonists understand the limitations of the technology. At the other end of the scale, you've got well performance verification, which would involve a few people in white coats coming out with a load of sampling equipment and taking samples and sending it to labs and conducting far more thorough testing of the indoor environment. So when we come to talking about standards, about monitoring technology, I would say that is the big issue. So, for example, I wouldn't say that I'm not aware of a monitor that could currently be used to satisfy the rigor of the well performance verification tests, i.e. that process of technicians coming out and taking samples. So I would say that is the issue. We need to understand what we are measuring, and then we need to understand how we can best go about measuring that. In an immature and probably fast developing market, that certainly does leave some pitfalls when we are talking about that health and well-being topic.
Some just kind of trying to get through these questions before we finish. Next one. Okay. Have you been able to sort of establish what the impact or the percentage impact of indoor air quality is on people's productivity? It's very specific, but I don't know if there's...
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's many answers to that question. You could talk about it in terms of health risks and how it would link to cancer and heart disease and things like that. In terms of a scalable productivity improvement, then no. I think you'll probably find that it will have different impacts in different settings, and certainly on different disciplines as well. You might find that air quality, for example, is much more likely to negatively affect the productivity of a receptionist or a CAD technician than perhaps it might do for an engineer who's used to muddy boots and a site office.
Yeah. One here about perception of well-being and enabling work productively. As rightly points out, the person who poses this question, they're very subjective. Is benchmarking therefore a challenge, or is that something you find challenging?
Yes, I think it can be, and there's different ways of doing it. I suppose you could do it in a bespoke survey, as I had done in the case study example that I showed you, but also a lot of organizations have a well-being related question in their kind of annual employee surveys. So if you're able to break that annual employee survey data down by building, then you can probably find some fairly interesting information in terms of the correlations between those well-being scores and the buildings that those occupants occupy.
Is Skanska doing anything to utilize IoT or sensors from the construction side to actually build smarter and then measure from the start?
Yes, we are. That isn't necessarily my area of expertise, but we embrace a lot of technology developments both in the way we design buildings, but also in the way that we manage construction sites and track assets and so on.
They kind of have a follow-up question with this as well about how do you expect to track data from life cycles perspective, and I think that's also and a really interesting trend within the industry, about like how we could do a much better job of looking at the whole life cycle of the building and perhaps be able to provide a lot of not just pre-occupancy data, but post-occupancy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the fundamentals of sustainable buildings for me and healthy buildings for me is that you need to concentrate on the operational phase of that life cycle just as much as you do on the design and the construction.
And that's sort of been an issue in the past, hasn't it? I mean, do you yourself feel that is changing now? Is the industry making a concerted effort now to think about post-occupancy more?
Yes and no. I think in pockets, yes, but I'm not totally convinced that is the case.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I would say certainly in pockets I have seen that, and what's really refreshing about linking sustainability to health and well-being is that there is much more of that focus on operation. So you could say, for example, in pockets such as the Well Building Standard, you can see that there really is that focus on operation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Final question for you, Chris. Have you done any comparable research? I guess looking, so you did the healthcare stuff. Do you have anything comparable on residential multifamily buildings, or do you know of anyone who's done that?
I personally don't, but so I mean, Skanska UK are not active in residential markets currently. So while we haven't got too involved in the health and wellbeing in homes side of things, the Better Places for People campaign, which is the World Green Building Council Healthy Buildings Report, they've got a residential section. There's retail, there's commercial buildings, and there's residential. So there's a number of reports on there. There's a lot of resources, information, summaries, and evidence of the impacts both on occupants of residencies, but also the communities around those residential developments.
Mm-hmm.
So my recommendation would be to look on betterplacesforpeople.org, and you'll find some very interesting information there.
Thanks. That is a good link and a good place to finish up. Is there a way that people could ask you questions if there's anything that they wanted to follow up?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to share my contact details through you, James.
Okay, yeah. So you can contact us at Memoori, support@memoori.com, or through LinkedIn and through our website.
Absolutely. And my email address is chris.pottage@skanska.co.uk. So do feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, and again, as I said earlier, this is being recorded, so we will be posting the audio and Chris's slides as well on our website, either this evening or probably tomorrow. So yeah, it just remains for me to say thanks very much, Chris, and also to our sponsor as well, Haystack Connect. Yeah, Chris, really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I know that I'm sure our audience really appreciated it too. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks to you as well.
Yeah, and thanks to the audience, and wish everybody a good end to the year and a happy holiday period, and look forward to seeing everybody in the new year. Thanks very much.